Hi everyone, welcome to Greenhouse Management. I've posted the syllabus online and we'll go over that a little bit in lab tomorrow. But today I wanted to just give you a little bit of information about what our first few days are going to be like and then talk a little bit about the history of the greenhouse industry. So today I'll be posting this first lecture module online. We'll also be potting up our poinsettia cuttings for a growing project this semester in lab tomorrow. We've got the media for you in pots, and last week I picked up the poinsettia cuttings from a rooting station down in Iowa, Cresco, Iowa, called Plant Peddler. So we have 4 interesting cultivars, and each lab group that you have been placed into will get a specific cultivar to work with. So tomorrow in Greenhouse Management Lab, I have the lab split up into 2 sections, and online there's a document that tells you what section to attend or what time period. So half the class is going to be there from 10 to 10:50 potting up your points, and half the class will be there from 11 to 11:50. You can email me if you have any questions. All right, so let's get started with a kind of a brief history of the greenhouse industry, and then I've also posted some links of some very interesting historical articles about how greenhouses actually were first developed. There's some very interesting info from the Europe on how fruit walls were used to grow lots of fruits in climates that were not very favorable to fruits, but then I'd like you to kind of keep an eye out while you're reading those pieces to see how the greenhouse industry evolved from that. All right, so these are the time periods where are specific to the greenhouse industry and how things got started. The first one to think about is in around 400 BC. Plato first mentions greenhouses. In 100 AD, just 500 years later, there's evidence that the Romans had used the mineral mica, which is a very translucent mineral, to place on top of structures for greenhouses. In 1600, the royal courts of Europe grew grapes, flowers, fruits, exotic plants that were brought back from discoverers in special houses called orangeries. And the creation of the first orangery was around 1619, and these lasted up into the 1800s, and you can still see evidence of orangeries today. Here's an orangery in Russia, in Moscow. It was built around the 1760s. On the right, you see an orangery at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, in London. There's also a very interesting orangery in France called the Versailles Orangery at the Versailles Palace. And take a look at these links to get a brief tour of the orangeries. Let's go on through the time periods now. Around 1650, Holland is noted for the first country to use charcoal to heat greenhouse structures. Prior to this, they have been heated mainly through passive solar energy. In 1720, there's the first mention of using glass for the roofs. Also in 1720, Andrew Fenouil is noted for building the first glass house. So glass sides and a roof. 1789, that's an interesting year. That's the year that George Washington had a greenhouse built. And I have a link there for you to take a tour of the structure, which is still standing. You might have a question about whether you need to know these specific dates. And the answer is yes. On quizzes and exams, I do like you to know the specific dates for just this subset of important dates in the greenhouse industry. Some tips for learning the dates, and one I use for, especially for something like George Washington. Think about when he was around in history. You know that 1776, our nation was built, and he was our first president, right? And so the date closest to that, 1789, that's pretty reasonable, right? That he was still living and would be building a greenhouse. So use those kinds of rationale to help you remember. 1799, that's when Grant Thornburn is noted as the first U.S. florist, and the florist industry being an important part of the greenhouse industry. There's some fascinating information on Grant Thornburn. He's from Scotland, and if you search online, you'll find some readings, some of his books that he wrote about his experience growing up in Scotland and then immigrating to the United States and starting his business. He's noted as selling the first potted plants in his store. I believe it was, I think geraniums are mentioned. All right, progressing on, we have 1830. That's an important date because that's when the cast iron stove and hot water heat was noted for heating our greenhouses, and that began in New York City. We use hot water heat today to heat our greenhouse. 1855 is a date when F.A. Lord started building greenhouses, and he joined with W.A. Burnham in 1883, a couple decades later. But Lord and Burnham is a very well-known greenhouse operation or greenhouse manufacturing company. Another time period to know is 1879. This is the year that the Society of American Florists was formed. So a lot of greenhouses around the United States in every town would have a small greenhouse, or maybe, and they would get progressively larger, but a lot of towns were noted for having a local florist who had a greenhouse, and they would grow their flowers and potted plants for customers in the greenhouses. So by 1890, just a decade later, there were some 5,000 greenhouses established in the United States. In 1900, the retail florist industry really took off, and a retail business being somewhere where you as a customer would go and purchase plants that have been grown by a wholesale greenhouse, for example. You've probably learned in some of your history classes that the 1930s and 40s wasn't a very good couple of decades for our country. And there was the Great Depression, and a lot of profits were very low for businesses. And during this time, inefficient growers really got into trouble. And so the number of greenhouses decreased. Those businesses that were able to thrive or survive basically in the 1940s and 40s really looked into increasing their efficiency in growing crops. So some of those things that led to efficiency were the part of the country that they were located in. So if you wanted to grow a good crop that required lots of sun, you would maybe think about relocating to Florida or California where sunshine is in abundance. Another thing that helped increase the efficiency was the development of fiberglass, polyethylene, poly for greenhouse coverings, and also the development of plastic for plastic pots. You can imagine the weight of a plastic pot would be a lot less than some of the earlier pots of clay ceramic. Mist systems also were developed in the 40s and 50s. The 1970s, what happened during that period? There was a large energy crisis, and greenhouse growers started looking into what they could do to conserve energy in their greenhouses. Later on, we'll look at some of the specific things that can be done. There is also an increase in the number of imports from other countries and an increase in green plants for interiors. The 70s is known for a great increase in the number of houseplants that the consumers would purchase. During the 80s, we see a lot of automation, and I'll talk about automation in a little bit, but that automation helped to decrease the labor cost. Plugs were developed in the 1980s, growing plants in uniform containers of media. Tray mechanization helped move plants around the greenhouse in these large shelving units that were attached on sort of a monorail that went throughout the greenhouse. Also in the 80s, we see a rise in the computerized environmental control of greenhouses. We'll have some experience working with our Priva system, which is a computerized control system for our greenhouse and is used widely in the industry. And then finally in the 80s, another thing that helped increase efficiency was the use of barcodes and being able to track individual pots and crops. In the 1990s, we see a lot of interest in environment, and so a lot of environmental codes were written for the greenhouse industry, especially for water runoff. Water runoff from a greenhouse site can contain excess nutrients, it can contain pesticides, growth regulators, disease, and so there were a lot of codes written to help protect the environment around greenhouses and workers that work in the greenhouse. Water quality is a big one that was developed in the 1990s, so there's a great interest in the quality of water. There was a greenhouse operation in South Carolina that I knew of, and they had a bald eagle nest located on their site right above their irrigation pond. And they knew that if that bald eagle nest failed or there was problems with the chicks or whatever, that they would be in some trouble. And then we get to the 2000s. You see in the 2000s a lot more continuation of automation. Water conservation, not just quality, but conserving the amount of water that we put on crops and use for crops was important. The quality of water. Energy conservation, that still was important. And then we see this word sustainable practices. So a lot more emphasis these days in making sure that whatever processes you're developing for your greenhouse are sustainable. And we'll dive deeper into that as the semester goes. One example of a sustainable practice might be the use of some form of compostable pot instead of plastic. They can have problems too. Sometimes the compostable pots develop molds and things, and that really can't be used to sell plants. So there is a lot of research that goes into developing something like a compostable pot. Supply chain management is a term that is important for the greenhouse industry. There are particular jobs that just focus around being able to manage the supply chain for an operation. When I was down at Plant Peddler last week, they were using their supply chain management software to import all their orders from customers for young plants that will be shipped out in the spring. They're already getting orders in for that now, so the growers know what to plant. In 2014, that date is important because the organization called American Hort was formed, and that was a merger between the Ohio Florist Association, the OFA, and the American Nursery and Landscape Association, the ANLA. And they combined to manage their resources and they put on a yearly show called Cultivate now in Ohio, and it is a really a first class nursery show to go to. People from all over the world will attend the Cultivate show. Of course, this year it was all done virtually. All right, let's take a look at what I was talking about, automation versus mechanization. I'd like you to know the difference between these two. And mechanization is the replacement of a task done by humans. For example, here's a great picture of someone using what's called the tray system to move plants around a greenhouse. So instead of walking around a greenhouse with 2 trays in your hand or a stack of trays, they are stacked onto this moving cart that gets circulated throughout the greenhouse, and they can push it around to wherever they need those plants to go. So they're just replacing one task done by a human. Automation is the replacement of an entire process. For example, think about orchid production these days. The orchid production is highly automated, and this means everything from growing the plants as plantlets through tissue culture, potting them up into successively larger pots. This is all done in an automated process with sometimes robots and machines taking the place of humans. This video I have posted here on orchid production, I'd like you to watch that, and we'll have a discussion about what you see as to the types of automation practices that you notice in orchid production. All right, so that's the end. That is a brief history and look at the greenhouse industry. I have several links for you to take a look at. They're posted right underneath this lecture. And don't forget to watch the video, especially of the orchid production, to get a sense of what processes are automated, and take a look at what processes are mechanized, and see if you can tell the difference between those two. And that's it for today.